Born in 1914, Akira Ifukube was raised in the central Tokatsu plain of Hokkaido, an area with a large Ainu population and rich in Ainu culture. Being the aboriginal people of Japan, the Ainu were treated as outcasts in general society, but a young Ifukube ignored this prejudice and immersed himself in their culture. He was exposed to a wide variety of both Ainu and Japanese folk songs, and the improvisational image of music and dance from these experiences freed his mind from restrictions of music theory, setting him apart from other students of music. Ifukube was virtually self-taught in music since his stern father was of the opinion that music was not something that a man should spend his time studying. As a result, he was a forestologist for the municipal forest of Hokkaido, but music always remained his passion. Hearing Jean-Francois's concertina for piano and orchestra while in Sapporo for attending his brother's wedding, Ifukube decided to move to the city and pursue music more aggressively. He wrote his first orchestral work, Japanese Rhapsody, at the age of 19, and won the Cherepnin Prize for Outstanding Japanese Musical Work for Orchestra in 1935. As a result, Ifukube met with Alexander Cherepnin in Russia and studied with him for a week, learning modern composition and orchestration. Due to his expertise on wood, which came from his musical study of wood acoustics, he managed to escape combat duty in World War II by being assigned to study the all-wood British warplane de Havilland Mosquito, which had been captured. Using X-rays and electricity for his research, but without any special protection, Ifukube fell ill at the time the war was concluded. While still hospitalized, he listened to the surrender ceremony on the radio, and as General MacArthur arrived, he was stunned to hear one of his military marches being played to welcome him. Employment in post-war Japan was scarce, and for musicians it was nearly impossible to find any paying jobs. Ifukube's longtime friend and classmate Fumio Hayasaka, who was soon to become Kurosawa's main composer, invited his old friend to follow him in composing music for motion pictures, and by the late 1940s he had joined Toho for this purpose. Learning the technique of film scoring proved difficult since this aspect of filmmaking was generally ignored in Japan, so he turned to opera for guidance. His first film was The End of the Silvery Peak, during which he had an argument with director Senkichi Taniguchi about the scoring of a skiing sequence between two young lovers, an incident which garnered him a reputation of being somewhat argumentative with directors. Indeed, in his only experience with Akira Kurosawa, the two strong-willed men clashed severely during the making of the appropriately named Quiet Duel. But Ifukube persevered. When he was asked to score Godzilla in 1954, many of his contemporaries were against taking the job and also advised him to decline owing to the great difficulty of the subject matter and fear of being typecast. Instead, Ifukube embraced the challenge and created a score which not only held its own against Honda's stark and powerful images, it actually enhanced them and magnified the film's impact. A prolific source of film scores, Ifukube worked for all of Japan's major studios, though predominantly for Toho, scoring as many as 16 films per year. His repertoire was diverse. In addition to monsters and science fiction, he could handle drama as well as action, and he tackled critically acclaimed pictures such as The Harp of Burma, Chirshingura, and Sandakan 8. In addition to writing music for more than 200 feature films, he also did limited work on television, a medium which he always felt to be too small for his music, as well as stage and radio dramas, all while building an impressive body of classical composition. He retired from film scoring in the late 70s to pursue teaching. Concerned that his music would seem outdated, he repeatedly turned down a steady procession of people who tried to get him to resume scoring for the revival of Godzilla, which began in 1984. After Godzilla vs. Biollante, his daughter told him, "No matter how hard you try to escape Godzilla films, they always use your name and melody lines, so why don't you just do the next one yourself?" When he agreed to score a documentary film about ancient Japanese history around the same time, he lost his alibi and finally came out of retirement to score the next 3 Godzilla films, before being passed over by director Yamashita for Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. But for Godzilla's final film, Godzilla vs. Destroyer in 1995, he eagerly took up the baton for a final time. Since he had been a part of Godzilla's birth, he felt it only proper to have a part of the monster's death. Ifukube has described his unique scoring style as ostinato, which is the repeated use of a short motif, such as in bolero, typical of the Japanese and Ainu folk music which influenced him as a youth. Ironically, this was in direct contrast to the advice he had received from Cherepnin in his youth, who warned him to avoid ostinato at all costs. Whereas his classical works show the influence of non-traditional composers such as Stravinsky and Mussorgsky, his film scores seem more influenced by European composers Sergei Prokofiev and Jacques Ibert. His policy in film scoring was, in his own words, to express rather than to explain. His music was meant to complement the images on screen, and as such he could never understand the public's fascination for listening to his scores outside of the context of film. Ifukube always leaned towards economy in writing film music, both in the number of themes and the total amount of music. In contrast to most composers, he was bold enough to admit that sometimes silence was much more effective than music. The conditions under which Ifukube scored films would be all but incomprehensible to Western film composers. The typical time which he was given to write a score was 3 to 4 days, and barely that much again for recording and mixing, a limitation which Ifukube himself described as very frustrating. Because he always operated on a small budget and recording studios were small to begin with, Ifukube had to write his scores for small orchestras, which in turn influenced his choice of instruments. Especially for monsters, he needed a large sound, even if the number of players was small, so he favored low sounds like contrabass. Strings were his preferred instrument of expression, but often brass and percussion were needed to add power. At recording sessions, Ifukube was a firm believer in a technique that most composers shunned. He wanted the orchestra facing the screen to see the images they were playing to. Especially in the case of monsters, he felt it was impossible for players to be sufficiently aggressive without seeing the image of the monster. He did not want a subtle or sophisticated performance. Ifukube would normally conduct the orchestra during rehearsal and allow his assistant to conduct the actual recording once the orchestra had been properly instructed. The impact of Ifukube on Godzilla cannot be overemphasized. There seems no doubt that his special ability to musically express the sheer power and spectacle of these larger-than-life images allowed the monster to reach and even exceed its potential. Ifukube's scores made these films something remarkable, something that could stand the test of time. He impacted these films to a degree perhaps unmatched by any other composer.